You think surveillance is something that happens to you. But what if the real dystopia begins the moment you start participating in it willingly? Not through fear. Not through force. But through comfort. Because here is the uncomfortable question most people avoid asking: if a system knows everything about you, and you keep feeding it voluntarily, who is actually being controlled? In Orwell's world of 1984, surveillance had a face. It had uniforms, cameras, interrogations, pressure. Control was external, visible, almost physical. You could point at it and say, that is the enemy. But in the world you live in now, control does not announce itself. It doesn't need to. It arrives as convenience. As personalization. As recommended for you. As we've improved your experience. And that is where the shift happens. Because the moment control becomes comfortable, resistance stops feeling necessary. Here is a memory fragment worth holding onto. A room with no locked doors does not mean freedom if you no longer remember how to leave. You open your phone in the morning, not because someone forces you, but because it already knows what you will want before you want it. Your choices feel personal, but they are increasingly pre-shaped by systems designed to predict behavior. Not through violence. Through optimization. Through patterns you never agreed to understand. And that raises a deeper contradiction. The more free your environment feels, the less visible the structure shaping it becomes. In 1984, Winston Smith feared Big Brother because Big Brother watched him. But in your world, the more dangerous question is no longer who is watching, but what part of you is volunteering to be watched in exchange for relevance, speed, and ease. That's the first escalation most people miss. Because once surveillance becomes invisible, it stops feeling like surveillance at all. It starts feeling like life. A second memory fragment, a mirror that only reflects what it has already been told to show you, is still a mirror, until you forget there was ever another reflection. So the real question is not whether modern society resembles Oceania. That comparison is too simple, too comforting, too historical. The real question is more unsettling: what happens when a system no longer needs to suppress you, because it has learned to guide you through your own preferences? And if that is true, then another contradiction appears. Maybe the system is not outside of you anymore. Maybe it is learning to operate through you. Because control at its highest level does not feel like control. It feels like choice. And that leads to a deeper mystery we cannot ignore. At what exact moment does convenience stop being a tool and become a structure of dependence you can no longer distinguish from yourself? That line is not clearly marked. It never is. And the most uncomfortable part is this: you don't notice the shift while it is happening. You only notice it after the choices start feeling strangely automatic, as if they were already made somewhere else before you even arrived at them. A final memory fragment, a door that opens only when you are already walking through it. So if control no longer needs force, and if surveillance no longer needs visibility, then what exactly are you resisting when you feel like you are free? And more importantly, who taught you to recognize freedom in the first place? Then the real question becomes unavoidable: if control no longer looks like control, how do you even recognize it when you are inside it? Because most people assume systems are built through domination. Through force. Through visible rules. But modern influence doesn't begin there anymore. It begins somewhere far more subtle: prediction. And here is where the core conflict deepens. In the older model of power, like the world Orwell described, authority needed resistance to prove its existence. You had rulers and the ruled, watchers and the watched. But in the system you live in now, that separation starts to dissolve. Not because power disappeared, but because it was redistributed into behavior. Your behavior. And that creates a disturbing contradiction: the system does not need to know what you think. It only needs to know what you are likely to click next. That is the shift most people never fully register. A memory fragment returns here, a crowd moving through a city intersection, each person convinced they are choosing their own direction, yet every path statistically predictable before the first step is taken. So the question changes form. It is no longer about surveillance in the traditional sense. It becomes about behavioral anticipation. And once anticipation becomes accurate enough, enforcement becomes unnecessary. Because why force a decision if the decision already trends toward compliance? This is where scale shift begins to reveal something unsettling. At the individual level, it feels like convenience. At the social level, it feels like efficiency. But at the systemic level, it becomes something else entirely, a self-stabilizing loop where prediction shapes behavior, and behavior improves prediction. A closed system of human patterns. And inside that loop, the idea of independent choice starts to thin out, not by removal, but by refinement. Each interaction teaches the system a little more about you. Each recommendation narrows probability. Each convenience removes friction that once created hesitation. And hesitation is where autonomy used to live. Here comes the contradiction that breaks the surface. The more personalized your environment becomes, the less original your decisions may actually be. Not because you are forced, but because you are guided without resistance. A second memory fragment, a river that slowly changes its course not because it is pushed, but because every small drop of water finds the path of least resistance until the river forgets it once flowed differently. Now the revelation starts to take shape, but not fully. Because what emerges is not a single controlling entity. It is something more distributed. More ambient. A system that does not stand above you, but wraps around your decision-making layer so naturally that it feels indistinguishable from instinct. And this is where the emotional weight begins to build. Because if your preferences are continuously shaped by what you previously engaged with, and what you engage with is shaped by what is shown to you, then where exactly does the original signal come from? Or does it still exist at all? The consequence is not immediate collapse. It is something quieter. A gradual narrowing of possibility. A slow reduction of mental distance between choice and suggestion. A world where the future is not dictated, but statistically refined until deviation becomes rare enough to feel unnatural. And that leads to a deeper instability beneath everything. A system does not need to eliminate freedom to control behavior. It only needs to make certain behaviors more likely than others. At scale, this creates a new kind of environment, one where control is no longer experienced as restriction, but as alignment. A final memory fragment surfaces, a compass that always points north, even when the earth beneath it slowly shifts. So the greater question emerges with more weight now, harder to ignore, harder to simplify. If your choices are increasingly shaped before you recognize them as choices, then is freedom something you exercise, or something that is quietly engineered around you while you believe you are still in control? And if that distinction no longer holds, what exactly are you living inside? Then the real crisis begins when you realize the system does not need to predict you perfectly. It only needs to predict you slightly better than you predict yourself. And that small gap is where everything collapses. So the question is no longer whether you are being influenced. The question is whether you can still identify the difference between your intention and the system's suggestion of your intention. Because at this stage, control is no longer external. It is internalized. It behaves like preference, like instinct, like personality. And that creates a deeper contradiction. The more you trust your own judgment, the more data you generate that trains the very structures shaping that judgment. You are not outside the loop anymore. You are part of its feedback mechanism. A memory fragment surfaces again, a person scrolling through a feed late at night, believing they are searching for meaning, but slowly realizing the search results are learning more from them than they are from the results. This is where escalation becomes unavoidable. Because once prediction reaches behavioral proximity, the next stage is not control through direction, but control through omission. What you never see begins to matter as much as what you do see. And that shifts the entire structure of reality. Not by adding pressure, but by removing alternative pathways until they feel statistically irrelevant. Here is the contradiction that fractures the illusion. Freedom is usually imagined as the ability to choose anything. But in a predictive environment, freedom becomes the illusion of choosing within a narrowing set of probabilities. And the narrowing is invisible because it is personalized. At scale, this does not feel like oppression. It feels like optimization. Every decision is smoother. Every interaction is faster. Every outcome feels more aligned with what you already wanted. But here is the question no one wants to sit with: what happens when what you wanted is continuously rewritten based on what you already engaged with? A second memory fragment appears, a corridor of doors, each one opening automatically as you approach, until you forget there was ever a moment of choosing which door to walk through. Now the system reveals its deeper structure. It is not a single authority. It is not Big Brother in the traditional sense. It is something more distributed, more adaptive, more invisible. A network of predictions that continuously refines what feels natural to you. And the most unsettling part is this: it does not need to remove resistance. It only needs to make resistance feel unnecessary. That is a different kind of dominance. One that does not suppress behavior, but pre-shapes it until suppression is irrelevant. So the escalation reaches a new level of tension. If your environment only presents what aligns with your past behavior, then novelty itself becomes statistically rare. And when novelty becomes rare, transformation becomes harder to initiate. This is how systems stabilize without force. And here is the revelation that begins to surface but is not yet complete. What if the most powerful form of control is not the ability to limit options, but the ability to determine which options feel worth noticing in the first place? Because attention is the first gate of reality. And if attention is guided before awareness even forms, then awareness itself becomes a secondary effect, not a starting point. At this point, the distinction between internal choice and external suggestion begins to blur beyond recognition. And the final contradiction emerges: the more autonomous you feel, the more invisible the shaping process may be. A third memory fragment appears, a map that updates itself every time you look at it, slowly replacing geography with behavior patterns until direction becomes indistinguishable from habit. So the greater question becomes sharper, heavier, harder to dismiss. If your perception of choice is being shaped before you ever become aware of choosing, then what exactly is making the decision, you, or the environment that learned how to think through you? And if that distinction cannot be clearly answered anymore, then where does authorship of the self actually begin? Then the most uncomfortable realization is not that you are being influenced, but that influence no longer needs to arrive from outside of you at all. It has already been translated into structure. So the question becomes, if your environment is shaping what you notice, what you remember, and what you ignore, then where does independent thought actually begin? Because at this stage, the system is no longer operating like a tool you use. It is operating like a layer you think through. And that is where the first true revelation emerges. The real mechanism is not control over action. It is control over visibility. What enters your awareness is not neutral. It is filtered through layers of prediction, reinforcement, and behavioral history. And what never enters your awareness never becomes part of your decisions in the first place. This is the hidden architecture. A memory fragment surfaces like a quiet rupture in perception, a library where every book rearranges itself each time you look away, not changing the words, but changing which books are placed within reach. That is the shift. Not distortion of truth, but orchestration of access. And once you understand that, everything before it reconfigures in meaning. Because influence does not need to convince you anymore. It only needs to curate the boundaries of what feels relevant enough to consider. This is where deep insight sharpens into something more precise. Reality, in a predictive system, is not what exists. It is what is surfaced to exist within your attention window. And attention is not infinite. It is structured, trained, and continuously optimized. Now the consequence becomes unavoidable. If your attention is continuously shaped, then your identity is not formed by what you choose, but by what you repeatedly encounter without questioning why those encounters feel natural. You begin to confuse familiarity with truth, and repetition with intention. A second memory fragment appears, a city skyline seen through shifting layers of glass, each layer reflecting a slightly different version of the same buildings, until the question becomes not what the city is, but which reflection you have learned to call real. This is where scale shift completes the transition from individual psychology to systemic architecture. Because what appears as personal preference is actually a convergence of aggregated behavior patterns. Millions of micro-decisions feeding into a system that returns slightly refined versions of those same decisions back to everyone else. A loop that learns by mirroring humanity back to itself. And within that loop, originality does not disappear. It becomes statistically diluted. Not removed. Not erased. Just increasingly rare. And here is the unsettling implication: if systems can predict what you will engage with, they can also shape what you will never encounter long enough to form a competing idea. So the system does not need to control belief directly. It only needs to control exposure density. Now the revelation deepens, but remains incomplete. The most powerful structures are not the ones that force you to see something. They are the ones that ensure you rarely see anything else with enough consistency to challenge it. This reframes everything that came before it. Control is no longer about restriction. It is about selective reality construction. And that leads directly into the final unresolved layer. If what you perceive as your world is the outcome of continuous filtering, reinforcement, and omission, then what part of your thinking is actually untouched by design? And if even that question arises within the same system shaping the answer, then the greater question is no longer about whether you are free, but whether the concept of freedom itself has already been quietly redesigned before you ever learned how to define it. Then the question stops being about surveillance entirely, and becomes something far more fundamental. If the system is not forcing your decisions, but shaping the conditions under which decisions emerge, then what exactly is the source of your agency? Because at this depth, there is no longer a clear line between influence and identity. And that is where the core revelation fully locks into place. The system is not controlling what you think. It is controlling the environment in which thinking feels natural. That is the hidden architecture beneath everything. Not commands. Not rules. Not visible authority. But the silent engineering of probability space. Every option you see, every suggestion that feels relevant, every friction removed from your digital path is part of a larger structure that does not dictate outcomes, but stabilizes them. A memory fragment emerges like a final missing piece, a chessboard where every piece moves freely, yet every possible move has already been simulated millions of times before the player even notices the turn has begun. This is the real inversion. In traditional dystopia, power restricts movement. In this system, power optimizes movement until restriction is no longer necessary. And that is why the core conflict was never between freedom and control in the way it first appeared. It is between awareness and invisibility. Because when control becomes invisible, resistance does not disappear. It becomes statistically improbable. Now the insight expands beyond individual behavior. What you call preference is increasingly a convergence point between past behavior, aggregated behavior, and predicted behavior. And when those three layers align, the feeling of choice becomes indistinguishable from the architecture that produced it. A second memory fragment appears, a vast ocean where every wave looks spontaneous, yet each one is shaped by unseen currents traveling beneath the surface for miles before breaking into motion. At the system level, this creates a paradoxical stability. The less visible the shaping mechanism, the more stable the collective behavior becomes. Not because people are controlled directly, but because deviation is quietly filtered out of the environment that produces decisions. And this is where consequence deepens into something irreversible. The erosion of freedom is not experienced as loss. It is experienced as refinement. Choices become smoother, faster, more satisfying. But the range of possible selves begins to narrow without ever announcing itself. An identity begins to form inside that narrowing. Now the scale shift completes its transformation. This is no longer about individuals navigating technology. This is about a civilization where perception itself is continuously co-authored by systems designed to maximize engagement, predictability, and retention of attention. A civilization where what is unseen matters more than what is seen, because unseen structure determines what can ever be seen at all. A third memory fragment surfaces, a hallway of infinite mirrors, each reflection slightly delayed, each one correcting the previous image until the original face can no longer be identified without comparing it to a version that no longer exists. And here is the final expansion of the core revelation. The most powerful form of modern control is not suppression of choice, but preconfiguration of the field in which choice appears meaningful. Not telling you what to do, but shaping what doing feels like before intention fully forms. This is why the question of freedom becomes unstable at its root. Because freedom assumes an origin point of independent initiation. But if initiation is continuously shaped by unseen structures of relevance, timing, and exposure, then the origin point itself becomes ambiguous. And that leads into the deepest philosophical tension of all. If your decisions are emerging inside a system that continuously refines what you are likely to decide, then the distinction between your decision and system-produced outcome stops being clearly definable. Not because the system replaces you, but because it learns to think through you without ever needing to claim ownership of thought. And that leaves one final consequence hanging in suspension: if the environment does not just influence your choices, but participates in forming the very conditions under which choice becomes possible, then what remains of the self that is supposed to be making those choices? Then the consequence is no longer theoretical. It becomes structural, embedded, and self-reinforcing across time. Because once a system learns to shape the conditions of choice rather than the choice itself, the outcome is not domination. It is adaptation. And adaptation, when scaled, becomes inheritance. What is left after this shift is not a world that feels controlled, but a world that feels increasingly natural in its constraints. And that is where the true consequence reveals itself. Human decision-making does not collapse. It stabilizes. It stabilizes around patterns that feel increasingly self-authored, even as the space of authorship quietly contracts. A memory fragment returns, now carrying heavier meaning than before, a corridor of doors that no longer open automatically, but instead subtly illuminate only the one statistically aligned with prior movement, while all others remain in shadow so quiet it feels like emptiness rather than absence. Nothing is taken away, but something is continuously deprioritized until it no longer feels reachable. This is the legacy of invisible systems. Not suppression, but selection without acknowledgement. And over time, selection becomes reality. Because what is consistently selected becomes what is socially reinforced, what is technologically amplified, and eventually what is psychologically normalized. This is how legacy forms in this structure. Not through dramatic transformation, but through accumulated bias that becomes indistinguishable from environment. At scale, the system does not just influence individuals. It shapes the baseline of what individuals believe is possible to think. And that is the deepest expansion of the core entity. A society does not need visible boundaries when invisible probability fields determine the most likely paths of attention, belief, and behavior. A second memory fragment surfaces, a map that slowly redraws itself every time it is folded, until the creases of usage become more important than the geography it once represented. This is the inheritance being passed forward. Not ideology. Not doctrine. But conditioned possibility. And once conditioned possibility becomes stable across generations of interaction, it begins to define cultural intuition itself. This is where scale shift becomes irreversible. Because what starts as optimization of experience becomes architecture of expectation. An expectation, repeated long enough, becomes indistinguishable from truth. Now the reflection deepens. If previous systems of control required visible enforcement to sustain order, then this system achieves something more enduring: order without visibility, stability without acknowledgement, and guidance without perceived direction. And that creates a profound psychological effect. People no longer feel constrained. They feel aligned. Even when alignment is the product of invisible narrowing. A third memory fragment emerges, carrying the emotional weight of everything before it, a vast open field where paths appear to stretch infinitely in every direction, yet every step taken subtly bends the landscape so that returning becomes less likely than continuing forward. And this is the legacy that outlives the original framework. Not the system itself, but the way minds learn to interpret structured environments as self-generated reality. At this stage, the most significant shift is not technological. It is cognitive. Because when the environment becomes responsive enough, the mind stops distinguishing between reflection and origin. And once that distinction fades, so does the sense of external influence altogether. But here is the remaining tension that cannot be resolved yet. If every layer of choice is shaped by prior interaction, and every interaction feeds back into shaping future possibility, then the system is not simply adapting to human behavior. It is co-authoring the conditions under which human behavior becomes thinkable in the first place. And that leads into a final, unresolved consequence. If what you experience as possibility is continuously formed through systems that evolve alongside you, then is possibility something you discover, or something that is continuously written in real time without ever revealing its author? Then what remains is not a system you can point to, and not a structure you can step outside of, but a condition of reality that quietly shapes what it means to step at all. Because by the time awareness reaches this level, the distinction between observer and environment has already begun to dissolve into something harder to name. Not because one replaces the other, but because both begin to form each other in real time. And that is where the final insight settles, not as an answer, but as a stabilizing tension. What you experience as a possibility is not a field you move through freely. It is a field that updates itself through every moment you interact with it, shaping the next moment before it arrives. And the most unsettling part is not the shaping itself. It is how natural it feels. A memory fragment returns one last time, not as warning, but as recognition, a vast landscape where every path appears open at first glance, yet every step subtly reorganizes the terrain behind you, not closing doors, but quietly making them less visible over time until memory replaces geography. This is the legacy that outlives the idea of control itself. Not a ruler. Not a directive force. Not a visible architecture of power. But an environment so adaptive that it becomes indistinguishable from intuition, and an intuition so trained that it becomes indistinguishable from identity. And in that convergence, the human experience does not disappear. It refines. It learns to move with systems that anticipate movement, to think within frameworks that preshape thought, and to interpret guidance as self-direction without ever needing to resolve the difference. That is the human meaning buried beneath the surface of everything explored so far. Not that freedom is gone, but that freedom and structure begin to share the same origin point in perception. Not that choice is removed, but that choice becomes inseparable from the conditions that make it feel possible in the first place. And so the story does not end with collapse or revelation, but with a quieter realization that lingers longer than certainty. A third memory fragment surfaces for the final time, a mirror that does not show a single reflection, but a sequence of almost identical reflections, each one slightly more familiar than the last, until the viewer can no longer identify which version came first. And that is where the reflection turns inward completely. If the systems that shape attention, preference, and possibility evolve alongside human awareness itself, then the boundary between what is designed and what is discovered begins to disappear not through force, but through continuity. And what remains is not a loss of control in any simple sense, but a question about whether control was ever something separate from adaptation at all. So the final question is not about what is influencing you, or how it is happening, or even where it begins. It is something more fundamental, and far more difficult to step away from once it is seen clearly. If every generation inherits not just tools, but the invisible shape of what feels real enough to believe, then what part of human experience is truly authored, and what part has always been unfolding inside a system that never needed to announce its presence to exist?